we're going to turn to our reflection. And I always look forward to reflections from Rose Leibowitz, and today is no exception. Go right ahead.
I wish you wouldn't bill me like that. You're going to hate it now I've said that. What I was thinking about this week was when people die, particularly people that I kind of related to, not necessarily met, but I'm talking about the famous people, and I look at their obituaries, I'm always kind of struck by different things. And so my reflection today is about two women who I have known about for years and have always respected and admired, who were around the same age, died within a few days of each other. And there were so many parallels in their lives that I absolutely found it quite fascinating. So I'm now going to read rather than just talk. I don't know about anybody else here, but for myself, when I heard about Tina Turner's passing, I overdosed on old videos of her singing her most famous songs, and my appreciation for her increased tremendously in what energy, what spirit. Similarly, the passing of Glenda Jackson made me review films I enjoyed many years ago, and she was a wonderful actress and a great politician. I read up on both of them and found some interesting parallels. Tina, from rural Tennessee, did not come from wealth, and she was a single mother by the age of 18. She graduated high school, had a job as a nursing assistant, but spent a lot of time at clubs with music, got her first break by being rather assertive and insisting on kind of getting to the microphone, and that incredible voice was heard. Glenda came from a working class family just outside Liverpool and left school at 16, spent the next 2 years working as a shop assistant. The way she told the story later on, she had friends in an amateur dramatics group, joined them, enjoyed it, and made the enormous leap of applying for a full scholarship to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, which is the top place you can go for acting in Britain. And she got in at the age of 19. So we have two tremendously talented women here from poor backgrounds. Their careers began in their 20s. Tina joined the Ike Turner's band, became lead singer. She had a child with Ike and married him. He was older than her and her boss, and it seems that the abuse that became famous later on started really early in the relationship, and she just lived with it and assumed that that's what it had to be for about 20 years. Glenda had a few lean years, as do all new actors and actresses, but her natural talent and charisma came through. She began to reap awards, including 2 Best Actress Oscars, various awards for every stage award you can think of at some point or other. She got married, divorced, had 1 child, definitely an A-lister. Changes came in middle age. When Tina, after a particularly violent incident, literally ran away with a little bit of money in her pocket and had to start again. For Glenda, the catalyst was Margaret Thatcher. She was so appalled and opposed to everything going on in Britain that she felt the need to stand for Parliament, did it, got elected, and was a backbench member of Parliament in Britain for 23 years, during which time she did no acting. Her life was entirely being a politician. And her speeches were just amazing. And I agreed with everything she agreed with, put it like that. Tina began headlining again, and her book, I, Tina, which was also made into a movie, had an effect on the culture because it was an example of somebody so famous and so revered who had suffered domestic violence. So you could almost say she began a whole switch in culture and appreciation of that. So they both had their political impact. In older times, read again. Glenda, as one might expect from a classically trained actor, made a splash in Parliament, and as somebody never afraid to speak her mind, was re-elected again and again. In older times, Tina got remarried to a Swiss man, almost the same age as her son, took up Swiss nationality and left the United States. Glenda, at the age of 80, came out of politics, went back on the stage, and played the first female King Lear in the West End. I mean, I remember reading the reviews of that and seeing shots of it. Absolutely incredible. Just before she died, she was making a film with Michael Caine that is yet to be released. So we will get that fairly soon. She did not miss a beat. They were very different in most ways, probably had nothing in common if they were to meet. But I found the deaths within a few days of each other have left a gap in my world, at least. And I just found it interesting just to see what their lives were like. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. As predicted, you did not disappoint us. Just a terrific blending of two important women. Thank you for doing that. We have reflections every week. And if anybody on this call today or within my voice on the recording would like to present a reflection to ICUJP, please contact me or Rick Banyales, from whom you get the invitations to these programs every week. We would love to diversify our reflections and draw on the wisdom and insights of a whole span of people that are part of the ICUJP family. I want to make a few announcements, and Rick has put his email address in the chat. First of all, we do have a small paid staff. We have expenses running ICUJP. We are a largely volunteer-run organization with a terrific board of directors that rolls up their sleeves every week and continues the work of ICUJP. In addition to putting on these Friday forums, we have major events throughout the year, opening the year with our closed Guantanamo rally at the federal building to try to close that shameful institution. And then we have other events, and I'll tell you in a moment about our Regas Awards. But we do depend on the kindness of friends and new friends. So you can go to icujp.org to make a contribution. In the announcement for today's meeting, if you scroll down, you'll find links and various ways to make those contributions. It's very helpful to us if you can post a monthly automatic contribution that lets us plan financially throughout the year, or you can make a one-time contribution or come in each month and make a contribution. We continue to meet on Zoom. This, of course, was a consequence of the COVID pandemic. We're exploring hybrid meetings, in person and online. We have found that being online allows people from all over the world, in fact, to join us, as well as all over the country and all over the state of California. So there's been a benefit to meeting by Zoom, but we have lost that camaraderie and the pressing of hugs and handshakes. And also, frankly, our donations have been down because of not being in each other's presence and passing the green bucket. So please do consider that ICUJP contributes to your lives, to your knowledge, to inspiring you, and be as generous as you can in making a donation. I do want to offer a save the date for September 10. Sunday, September 10 is our annual George Regas Courageous Peacemaker Awards event. And in this year, finally, we are going to be in each other's presence at All Saints Pasadena to hold our awards dinner this year. We're very grateful to All Saints for hosting us. It is the home of George Regas, our convener, and the inspiration for our work for so many years. We will be honoring people and organizations under the theme of housing is a human right. We're giving this year's program that theme because of the housing crisis in Los Angeles and Southern California and throughout this country, and the shameful treatment of unhoused people. So we hope you will join us on September 10. You will get further announcements about that program. We're pleased to announce that Anthony Manousis, who you see here on the screen, along with his wife, Jill Shook, will be honored, as well as All Saints' own housing program to help and care for unhoused people on the campus of All Saints Pasadena. And other honorees will be announced shortly. So we do hope you join us. 2 minutes to Sophia, because we were fully supportive of the labor action in Southern California. And as briefly as you can, because we have a full program, Sophia, just report into us to the capacity of that event, the nature of the event, and what was accomplished.
Well, I think the important thing was that people came together of all faiths. They did civil action. And I think for me, when we went to the protest, it was the moving testimony of the hotel workers that was important, everything they've gone through and wanting to live where they work, having the support of elected officials. They got arrested, they got a citation, to be with communities from all over, praying together, trying to see just a decent life, and to get a contract. Contract is very important. We know the Olympics are coming. The hotel workers are going to be overburdened, and we know that these corporations are making money at the expense of just human dignity. And so being a part of that, participating, and seeing just everyone in that space rising up, fighting for a decent wage. And it's something we all have to be a part of, but participating in it was surreal. And seeing a lot of old time activists come out and get arrested was also very moving. And I took some pictures and I shared it with them. And so Rosalio Munoz was one of them. He's been a part of this, but others, and just to see all people of faith willing to go that far is very important. And there's going to be continuing picket lines, and you could sign up. And I'll put the link in the chat if you want to pledge to go out and do 2 hours to stand on a strike and hold the line. They're asking for people to participate. If we can participate, that would be great. And just choose your area, and I'll put the link in the chat.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that. We had a program recently from Clue, Matthew Hom, planning and telling us about the labor action, coordinating 100 hotels whose contracts are up for renewal and renegotiation. We thank you, and we thank all the hardworking people who turned out.
Yeah, I'd just like to make an announcement that our nonprofit, Making Housing Community Happen, is sponsoring an affordable housing bus tour on July 15th here in Pasadena. And we're starting at the Salvation Army Hope Center, which is opening up this summer with 65 units of housing for people experiencing homelessness. And then we're going to look at 10 other sites in Pasadena that provide housing for low-income and unhoused families, people with mental illness, vets, and so forth. So we're inviting key leaders through the San Gabriel Valley and people who are activists to join us, and we hope to help people understand the benefits of affordable housing and hopefully become champions in their community once they've seen what it's like for themselves. So I put in the chat a link to our website, makinghousinghappen.org/events, and you can register. And please register soon, because the bus will start filling up. It's starting to fill up.
Yeah, thank you for doing that too. I didn't see that you'd already done that. Put the link to your website, so that's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
I saw another hand up.
Sophia.
Sophia. Yeah.
Okay, this week, California Care went to the assembly because they were opposing SB 70. That's the California Care single payer. Unfortunately, that passed. And then this weekend, on Sunday, we're going to be dealing with Kevin De Leon because we're going to table. There's going to be a huge event honoring Tierra at Lincoln Park, and there will be several hundred people there. The Salas brothers grew up right across the street from Lincoln Park, and that's where they're trying to build luxury apartments, 184 units. And for those of us that are fighting displacement and gentrification, we'll be tabling, and we're going to be asking for donations because we're going to file a legal challenge. And we're working on the appeal, and it's due on Monday to fight this mega complex. And also I decided to run for AD 52 grassroots candidate. I'm just tired and had to rise up because of ACO Reach. That was the deciding factor when I went to the convention and saw that they were going to go after Medicare. I'll put more about the bill sponsored by Pilar Charvo that deals with AGR4, which is to repeal ACO Reach, the privatization of Medicare.
Okay, good, thank you.
Let me turn to our guest, Sonali Kolhatkar. Sonali is a longtime partner with ICUJP. We've had many programs on KPFK with her. She has been a participant in many of our programs. I visualize at Emmanuel Presbyterian, a major event early on, speaking about Iran as the antagonism between the United States and Iran began to emerge. I think one of our earliest programs to understand that country and its people involved Sonali. Sonali has published a new book called Rising Up, The Power of Narrative in Pursuing Racial Justice. It was published only a few days ago officially by City Light Books. When we reached out to Sonali to organize today's event, she encouraged us to frame this as a conversation with her. And so I get to turn the tables on Sonali Kolhatkar and interview her after she has probably interviewed thousands of individuals across the span of her career. I told Sonali that I would open by asking her to take her time to describe her own personal spiritual and philosophical and human journey that has brought her to the intersection of social justice and peace and the media, which is at the heart of her new book. So Sonali, welcome, and we're so pleased to have you today.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Rick, and everyone else for being here this morning. I've told this story many, many times, but, and I write about it a little bit in the book as well. A few years ago, I did a TEDx talk called My Journey from Astrophysics to Radio, or How I Found Meaning in My Life. So as the name of that talk suggests, I didn't start out to be a journalist. I ended up here, however, and ended up doing what I was meant to do. So yeah, I'm originally from India. My parents are Indian. They're still Indian citizens. They moved to the United Arab Emirates before I was born. So you could say I was born an immigrant because in the UAE, you don't get citizenship for being born in the country. So I was born an immigrant, remained an immigrant, and at the age of 16, moved to the United States, again, of course, as an immigrant, on a student visa, leaving my entire family behind because I had a single-minded focus on wanting to be a physicist. I wanted to do science, and I wanted to live in a country where I could be free to say what I wanted to say without fear of consequence, which is something that the United Arab Emirates still doesn't enjoy, in spite of it being seen as sort of a liberal place. And then I was at the University of Texas at Austin, getting my degree in physics, and I got a second degree in astronomy. So I graduated with a double major and ended up at the University of Hawaii Institute for Astronomy in Manoa, where I went to graduate school with the intention of getting a PhD and, you know, having the very sort of standard academic career in astrophysics, and somewhere along the way that didn't work out, and I ended up in Pasadena, California, with just a master's, and got a job working on the Spitzer Space Telescope project at Caltech, where I'd had a summer job earlier. And I started really thinking about the world around me and thinking about the fact that I had all this educational privilege and I was using it to benefit, you know, NASA. And my turning point, if you will, came in 2000 when I was sitting at my desk at Caltech, and I stumbled upon the work that a feminist organization in Afghanistan did and does, RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. And I think many of you are familiar with RAWA, and their incredible organizing work. This is the oldest feminist organization in Afghanistan, and they really inspired me to kind of take a second look at what I was doing in my life. And I ended up quitting my job at Caltech and looking for another job, interviewed for a bunch of positions, and ended up at KPFK, where I was, a friend suggested I should try out because she had seen me speak in Afghanistan. You might know her, Farah Davari. She's still a friend, you know, well-known activist, Iranian American, who's involved with the nurses union for many years. Anyway, she suggested that I should be on the radio, which I thought at the time was pretty funny and kind of ludicrous, because I didn't have any journalistic background, but she kind of planted the seed in my head. And I ended up at KPFK, and you know, I asked them initially just for like a 1 hour a week position, but their morning drive time slot opened up and they asked me to try out, and I got lucky. And I realized that was my true calling. It was journalism and telling the stories of people, but also using my science background in ways that I had not anticipated before, which is uncovering the truth, because science is about figuring out how the world works, figuring out how the physical world works, whether it's on the level of biology, chemistry, astronomy, every level of the physical world, with how it works on a micro level all the way to a macro level. And journalism is about figuring out how society works. But it's even more than that. It's shedding light where there is darkness, and being a critical, you know, a critical structure within a democracy. That's the whole point of journalism, and that really was something I was attracted to, and it informs the work that I do today, and that led up to the writing of my new book. So yeah, not to go on for too long, but basically I found myself as a journalist. I stayed as a radio host for many, many years, and I remain doing that. Along the way, I just added new things to the skill set because I get bored easily, and I transitioned to making my radio show into a television show as well. I started getting into print journalism all the way back in 2006. It was my first book, Bleeding Afghanistan, Washington Warlords and the Propaganda of Silence, which I co-wrote with my partner, Jim Ingalls. which was my first foray into real print journalism. But I then became a columnist for Truthdig in 2015 after Truthdig closed its doors, which I'm now happy to say it's reopened. I started with the Independent Media Institute, and now, of course, I write for Yes, and I also edit for Yes Magazine, and my second book came out. So I'm a multimedia journalist, trying to use every platform available to me to do what is really narrative work, which is the work of intentional storytelling, and which is the topic of my new book. So hopefully that's a good answer, Steve.
It certainly is. And I learned so much just now about you and what has brought you to this work. I've had the privilege of reading portions of Rising Up. It's an extraordinary piece of work. I know that you have various book signings and speaking engagements. Maybe Rick is able at some point during the program to put in the chat a link to some of those speaking engagements where people can meet you and learn more about the book and your work. I think it's so important that you're joining us today. Obviously, this is a book that has been in your mind, in your heart for decades. It speaks to your direct involvement in this work. You are no one on the sidelines. And I think that's what's so impressive. But I think the timing is crucial. Only yesterday, the United States Supreme Court, at least the ultra-conservative wing of the court, struck down affirmative action. Now, this comes at a time when Republican legislatures across the country are cutting back on the very teaching of diversity and inclusion, where we're having the banning of books on race and gender. When the country in my lifetime is at one of its most divisive moments. And what I want to do this morning with you is try to understand where we are as a nation seen through the media that your book focuses on in large part, and to try to understand what has brought us to this, both historically and in a contemporary setting. So using your science background, I think we need to diagnose our society, and then later in our conversation, I think we have to think about correctives and the medicine that can be provided to help heal and cure the disease that is infecting the United States. So if we could begin by having you describe what you see as the current landscape, particularly with respect to the stories that are being told on television, in cable news, radio, movies, popular TV, and the entire spectrum of social media and media itself. What's your diagnosis of that, which you have found alarming and that justified you writing your book?
Thank you, Steve. Sometimes I think on the left in particular, it's been seen as a little bit fluffy to talk about pop culture and to think about how cultural shifts are part of how injustice gets perpetuated. And as someone who has been a journalist now for 20 plus years, what I've realized, and you were right that this book was something that was a long time coming and kind of percolating in me. What I've realized is that, we are steeped in storytelling and internalize the stories that are told around us. We have assumptions in our minds about how the world works and how it should be. And all of that is shaped by the things that we're exposed to from a young age, whether it's a teacher in a classroom, whether it's the books that we were read to, whether it is the movies that we go and watch and the newspapers that we read. They form the cultural fabric of the political views we hold and the things that we want in our lives. And my goal with this book was for us to start identifying, first of all, that there are these narratives all around us, identify what they are, identify the stories that we are being told, and then figure out how to change narratives to further the agenda of social justice. So if you just, if you look at the Supreme Court decision that you mentioned, the conservative court 6-3 struck down affirmative action on the basis of race. But that's not quite the story, right? On the surface of it, it's that they're taking race-based decision-making out of admissions. But actually they aren't. They're only taking out race-based decision-making for non-white folks. White people still have legacy admissions and donor-based admissions and all of these other ways in which affirmative action for white people is perpetuated in the college admission system. That has been left intact. And that fits very well in the story that conservative America holds up, that's built by the narratives all around us. And what is that story? That story is that America was founded by intrepid white settlers who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, carved their own destiny, and created a country out of nothing. And now we have these hordes of brown immigrants coming illegally across the border to take what's ours. We have Black people who are demanding special treatment, cutting in line ahead of us. And these resources that we've worked so hard for are being taken from us. And they're going to be the majority and we're going to be the minority. And and we can't stand for that. And you can't have free healthcare because I won't let my taxes pay for your healthcare. Every piece of conservative agenda item, every conservative policy in that story makes sense to them, right? That is their story. And that is upheld by Hollywood. You can go back and look at Gone with the Wind, and you can look at how a rich white woman's love life with slavery as just a backdrop and barely mentioned was the focus of the movie. And it glamorized white wealth, and it deified this idea of white supremacy. And that continues today because we've never truly, culturally apologized for, reconciled with the stain on the country's founding, which is the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of people from the African continent. And this is what forms the pervasive narrative in our nation that Fox News continues to perpetuate, and the entire constellation of right-wing media, and sadly the so-called liberal corporate media, don't push back against hard enough and kind of accept the status quo as if they're holding the line using some notion of objectivity, which really, simply means upholding the default of white supremacy. And that is what I want to interrogate in this book. I want readers to be able to see these narratives are all around us, whether we sometimes notice them or not. And they shape who we are as a country. And if we want social justice, if we want to live up to our ideal of democracy, if we want to live in a multiracial democracy, we have to change narratives. We have to change our culture, because we can't change policy before we change our culture. It won't last. We can't also just change the culture and not policy, right? Because then that's just PR. They have to go hand in hand. So yeah, I look at Hollywood, which, we live in the heart of Hollywood, and we just assume that our fellow Hollywood industry members who claim to be liberal include our values in their writing. That's what the right-wing media often blame Hollywood for doing, but they don't. They don't because they have clung to whiteness and white supremacy. They don't because they end up glorifying policing and gun culture. They end up making abortion a dirty idea. On certain issues, they have managed to, however, change the narrative and push the story. And we see examples of that. You know, same-sex marriage went from being unacceptable to being acceptable in 10 short years because Hollywood decided it was legitimate. And thus is the power of Hollywood's ability to change not just national but international culture, and then policies follow. And so we need Hollywood to do that specifically on the issue of racial justice. And it is not because Hollywood status quo is allowing it, but because Black and brown filmmakers are infiltrating Hollywood, clawing their way into the writers' rooms and changing narratives and changing the way in which stories are told. Sorry, Steve, I sort of went on a little bit too long, but please jump in and
No,
the conversation.
no, this is fascinating. And, you know, the benefit of our Friday forums is that you don't have to speak in sound bites. We can take some time to dig into these issues as you're already doing. I was prompted by something you said to tell listeners that I just wrote a book review of a book. Sometimes a book has the title that says it all. And this is a book called When Affirmative Action Was White. And it traces the period in the 20th century when all kinds of government programs, from the GI Bill to Social Security to fair housing, favored white people and white veterans. And now we're shocked if people have the audacity to raise the prospect of reparations. That book review, I will say, is on Truth Dig, and I too, Sonali, am happy to see Truth Dig back. A friend of ours, Michael Singh, some years ago, released a documentary called Valentino's Ghost, where he traced the racism of early movies in their treatment of Arabs and people from the Middle East. Do you have some examples as you develop your analysis and your diagnosis of Hollywood, of television, of the media, that are prime examples of how this narrative perpetuates a white-dominated theme?
Yeah, there's so many examples, right? Like you can look back and survey not just the history of movies in Hollywood, but you can look at contemporary products of Hollywood and see that sometimes very little has changed. I mean, you know, one of my favorite examples of how white-dominated Hollywood perpetuates white supremacy is Friends. You know, the TV show Friends. There's the easy examples like, you know, Indiana Jones or whatever that showcase racist stereotypes of people of color. For me, the even more insidious ones are the ones where people of color are entirely absent, right? So Friends, a very popular TV show set in New York, you know, fairly liberal-ish, where people of color are just simply absent, right? In one of the most diverse cities in the world. You know, what I point out is that Hollywood has basically perpetuated everything from racist caricatures and stereotypes of people of color. There have been some very in-depth surveys of that, so don't go into that in my book because other people have written that. But they also perpetuate white supremacy in ways that we don't really necessarily notice, that we might think are progressive, but aren't. Think about the movie Green Book, right? Written by a white filmmaker, was meant to showcase the horrors of Jim Crow segregation in the South. Instead, it relied on the age-old white savior trope, which was that you needed a white guy to help out the Black guy to survive the South. And I remember watching that movie with a white friend of mine. We both watched it from start to finish. My reaction internally, and I kept it inside me, I was kind of like, gritting my teeth, seething, and I love Viggo Mortensen, who's in that film, and he's such a progressive and actor. But this movie just rubbed me the wrong way. And at the end of the movie, my friend and I had discussed our reactions, and he had a very different. He thought, "Oh my God, what a great movie!" And I was like, "Oh gosh, no! We have to stop Hollywood from showcasing poor people of color as having no agency," right? And here's another example, which is that I point out in my book, and I have a whole chapter in my book called "Propaganda," pro-police propaganda. Pro-police propaganda is, to me, one of the most insidious and not visible tools of perpetuating white supremacist culture. And I point out not the easy examples, but the one that's harder to notice, which is the recent TV series Watchmen. I don't know if any of you have watched that show. And, the show starts out really promisingly, goes into the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. And you think, oh, this is going to be a great show. Damon Lindelof is the showrunner. And the whole show, it's based on a comic book series, and it has white supremacists, it has police officers, and it has masked crusaders. And what this show does is it basically shows white supremacist, like hate, people from a hate group, like KKK style white supremacists, going after Black people and going after police, right? So Black folks are the victims of white supremacists, but police are the victims as well. And what Damon Lindelof does is he casts Regina King, an incredible Black actress, in the role of a police officer. And he thinks in his mind that that's, kind of an innovative way to look at policing. And what he has, he reveals in interviews that he used to go on ride-alongs with the San Francisco Police Department. He idolized Don Johnson and Miami Vice, which was basically a cop buddy show that glamorized policing, where the bad cops were the bad apples, but in general, policing was noble and good, and cops were there to help people. Hollywood has never truly interrogated the fact that policing is a white supremacist institution that has its origins in the so-called slave patrols. So Watchmen and many, many other products of Hollywood have basically made policing into something that society must rely on and must embrace as a way for us to enjoy safety. And they've done it by over and over and over again showcasing cops as the good guys. What's worse is that they have a propensity to cast Black people as police officers. And this is where it gets really tricky. So Regina King beats up a white supremacist on Watchmen. She violates the law. The character she's playing beats up a white supremacist. She's breaking the law. But because it's a white supremacist getting beaten, what our audience is expected to do? We cheer on the fact that a cop is breaking the law and basically engaging in vigilante justice. Oh, and she's a Black woman, so how do we critique a cop? Of course not. And so this is very sly, and it's something that Hollywood has relied on over and over and over again. Think about all of the cops of color that you see on your screens. And in general, policing as a noble institution is something that Hollywood has long embraced, not necessarily because Hollywood thinks overtly in white supremacist consciousness, but because policing has protected whiteness and Hollywood has been white dominated. And so white writers write what they know. So if you're a white writer, you're going to write about your experience. And if all your experiences with cops have been good, have made you feel safe, then that's what you're going to write. And so that's what we see in Hollywood. And that's something that I critique and interrogate. Eventually, and I mean, look at how Hollywood is continuing this. We had the Oscar So White campaign that started on Black Twitter, challenging Hollywood to do better in representation and challenging the Academy to reward Black-made films or non-white films in general. And so things have started to change. And yet you still have Wes Anderson making a film with like 25 A-list white actors. Maybe he's thrown in like 2 Asian actors. And everyone's excited about the new Wes Anderson film. And how does Wes Anderson still get uplifted in 2023 as an important filmmaker when he can't even bring himself to have a cast on a film that reflects the racial diversity of this country? You don't think of Wes Anderson as a white supremacist filmmaker, and he doesn't think of himself as a white supremacist filmmaker. But if you're going to paint worlds where your characters are largely and almost entirely white, then you are part of the problem. So I point these things out. I want to my next book to be about economic justice narratives. And one of the things that I've noticed, just as Hollywood loves to cast Black and brown people as cops, Hollywood loves to cast Black and brown people as wealthy, as billionaires, or upper middle class folks. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air to Blackish, even Blackish, which was a groundbreaking TV show that I write about in Rising Up, is about an upper middle class Black family who had its origins, in South Central LA and in poverty-stricken neighborhoods, but it's still bringing an upper middle class perspective into Hollywood. What sets Blackish apart, of course, is that its showrunner is Black and therefore gets many, many things right about things like police brutality. However, then you have like Apple TV making a TV show like Loot, casting Maya Rudolph as a wealthy billionairess, billionaire heiress. The majority of billionaires are white, and Hollywood loves to cast people of color as wealthy folks. Why? Because that's a way to whitewash them, for lack of a better term. You can't dislike them if they're people of color. And if you're a good liberal, you're going to embrace characters played by people of color, whether they're cops or billionaires or whatnot. But what about reflecting reality, right? Going back to the issue of propaganda, I cite in my book, Color of Change's work. Color of Change is an amazing organization led by Rashad Robinson, who points out that there's an unwritten rule in Hollywood that the cops have to be Black and the victims have to be white. If you make victims of police brutality not white, you're not going to get your script greenlighted. That's an unwritten rule in liberal Hollywood. I mean, no wonder we live in a society that sees policing as so critical to keeping us safe, in spite of so much evidence that policing keeps us, policing perpetuates violence. Policing is a public health hazard, but not if you consume Hollywood.
What would you say to people who say we should applaud the depiction of middle class and upper class Black families or Black millionaires? Aren't we exemplifying that anything is possible
Yes.
in the American dream? What's your answer to that?
There's something, I've heard that before. And so here's the thing. It depends on your intention. And this is why the way I define narrative is intentional storytelling. It's not just storytelling, it's intentional storytelling. Every story we tell, whether we realize it or not, has an intention to, it's the moral of the story, the fable. So what is the moral of a story, or what is the point that we're trying to make? What is the goal of a TV show or a movie that depicts a wealthy person of color? Is it to show that wealthy people are just like us? If that's the case, then all you're doing is perpetuating the lie that billionaires are just people who've earned their way to the top. If your goal is to show that Regency era London didn't have Black and brown people among British royalty, but what if we imagined, just for a moment, fantasize that they could be, as Shonda Rhimes does in Bridgerton? That's what is her goal. Her goal, I mean, I don't want to speak for her and get inside her mind, but I'd like to think that I get a sense of, I'd like to think that Shonda Rhimes has a goal of racial justice at the heart of what she does, because what she does is she makes worlds possible. It's called world building. If Black and brown people can be seen as royalty in a fantastical interpretation of the past, then surely they can envision themselves as important enough to be as important enough to be seen as worthy of being royalty. Are the characters three-dimensional? Are they complex? Are they complicated? Are they funny? Are they inherently good or bad? It doesn't matter. If they're somewhere in between, do they have shades of gray? All of those are questions we should ask when we see narratives being built in the media. And so, yes, there is a difference between, casting a Black person as a cop and casting a Black person as the Queen of England in the past. And it depends on who's doing the writing and how. If we want stories of Black and brown people in Hollywood, we need to hire Black and brown writers, but they can't be the only token people of color in the room either, because they feel that pressure. As studies have shown, studies that I cite in my book, they feel the pressure of being tokenistic. They don't want to be the only person in the room saying, no, please don't perpetuate that awful racist stereotype. And I hate to be the naysayer yet again. So we need to have large percentages of writers' rooms be people of color. We need writers' rooms to reflect society as a whole. I mean, LA is steeped in Latino culture, and yet Hollywood cannot bring itself to properly portray Latino communities. I mean, it's shocking. So yeah, it depends on how the story is told, Steve, to answer your question.
Let's turn to the news, to, I was going to say nonfiction television, but so much of the news is fiction. I'm not sure if you coined it or not, but you refer to Fox News as faux news. And
I don't know if I coined it either, actually. It might have been something I just brought to the
I loved it. Here's a passage from your book. Right-wing media outlets such as Fox News have long pushed racist narratives to further their goals. And outlets like the New York Times, the so-called liberal media, do too little, too late to push back. So take both sides of that equation, including any examples you have at your fingertips of what has been and what do you see as the true impact of Fox News throughout its existence. And then what is the basis for your critique of liberal media as well?
I cite an interview that I did many years ago with Jen Senko, who is a filmmaker. I don't know if any of you have seen this documentary she made called The Brainwashing of My Dad. And it's a really important film that really helped me think about some of my white relatives. I'm married to a white guy, so I have in my family, they're from Boston. I have members of my family that are white that are, that range from liberal to right wing. And several people came to mind as I watched Jen Senko's documentary. She writes about her father being a very liberal-minded person, somebody who was happy, who had very, forward-thinking ideas about social justice, who was a trucker and who then would, at some point turned to right-wing radio, AM radio, and eventually to Fox News. And she watched him change. She watched his personality change. She watched him turn into an angry person filled with resentment, filled with completely ignorant notions of people of color and stereotypes. And that is precisely the point of Fox News. Fox News upholds the story that I mentioned earlier, which is the story of white supremacy, the myth of America, and that upholds white supremacy. And so Fox News has Fox News has continued its very inevitable slide toward openly promoting fascism, right? I mean, they may have taken Tucker Carlson off the air, but there's plenty of others still on the air, and others will follow Tucker Carlson to continue to promote his ideas of, the great replacement theory, which he talks about, the ideas of patriarchal greatness, of like men, he's very nostalgic for this idea of the white American strong man who's going to be the father figure. And so Fox News essentially paved the way for Donald Trump. It was very, very clear. However, what I point out is that it's not just on Fox News to have allowed Donald Trump to come to power, or rather rolled out the red carpet for Donald Trump to come to power. The so-called liberal media that Fox News loves to rail against couldn't bring itself to call Donald Trump a racist when he told everybody how racist he was right from the start. So his speech where he announced his candidacy in 2015, he all but said, elect me and I will make sure white people remain in charge in this country. And, and the Washington Post and the New York Times and NPR, they were appalled, you could tell, but they couldn't bring themselves to call him a racist. The Washington Post did this instead of like saying that when he said Mexicans were rapists, instead of saying that was racist, they had an in-depth fact-checking analysis about whether that was actually true. And oh, look, it turns out it's not. I'm like, why would you validate and legitimize this clearly false statement? Okay, fine. You want to do fact checking, but say at the outset that he was being racist, because the liberal media have seen or have decided that to use the R word shows bias, because they have bought into right from the start this myth of objectivity that the news is all about just relaying the facts. But of course, independent media makers like myself have always made it clear that you just bring a different set of biases to the table. And I'll wear my bias on my sleeve, which is that I will cover the news in favor of social justice, in favor of upholding democracy. But if you don't acknowledge your own biases, as they didn't with Donald Trump, they allowed him to speak for years before calling him a racist. It wasn't until 2 years into his tenure when he basically on Twitter said something to the effect of "go back to your country" to members of the squad, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, that NPR and Washington Post and others decided, we've had internal meetings and we've decided we're not going to call Donald Trump a racist. We've come to this painstaking conclusion after looking at all the facts. They were so proud of themselves that they could say this obvious thing, right? They enabled Trump with that silence in the first half of his presidency. And we have to showcase that. And we have to expose that. After the 2020 racial justice uprisings, many newspapers interrogated their past coverage and realized, oh, maybe we've been part of the problem all along. The LA Times issued an apology. Even National Geographic looked back at its own racist coverage. My favorite apology was the Kansas City Star News that actually looked at its, audited its coverage and then pledged to do better and laid out some goalposts for itself. Not a very big paper, but certainly did better than the other major media. But yeah, the right-wing news have been the worst of the perpetrators, and the so-called liberal corporate media have been part of the problem as well, from a different, in a different way.
Let's talk about objectivity. I think still to this day, a lot of people would bristle when you declare yourself that you think that objectivity is a mirage. There's a quote in another book The Nation That Never Was by Kermit Roosevelt, essentially he says, when you enjoy privilege, equality is seen as oppression.
Yeah.
That's
a great
so
quote.
dig into objectivity has been the cornerstone of journalism schools and journalism codes of ethics. It's been held up as the sine qua non of good journalism. But given everything you've explained to us, how do you believe objectivity itself has perpetuated this white dominated narrative?
I mean, it's the same thing that we were just talking about with respect to the affirmative action decision on the Supreme Court, right? White supremacy is the water we all swim in. And so if we aren't actually interrogating that air all around us, or whatever, the ether around us, the accepted foundation from which everything has stemmed, if we're not actively questioning that, then we're accepting that that's part of every story we tell. And so, yeah, if objectivity, if journalists like to think they're objective when they do some reporting, and if they're not actually interrogating white supremacy, then they're not being objective, and most don't. So, this idea that we're going to give equal weight to things, NPR loves that, right? NPR stations love to say that they don't have no rant, no slant, right? That's the idea. One of the slogans of some local radio NPR stations, I can't remember, was it KCRW or KPCC? This idea that they're going to showcase both sides of an issue always assumes that both sides carry equal weight, right? So if you're covering the issue of racism and you're bringing a Black person on and you're bringing a white person on, the idea that you're seeing both sides of an issue doesn't make sense if you live in a white supremacist culture. Just as, when we're talking about Israel and Palestine, the two sides are not equal, right? One side has all the power, one side has all the weapons, one side has all the credence and the bias, and the other side is fighting a David and Goliath fight. They're not equal. You can't pretend that they're equal. And so objectivity is a pretense. And there used to be this term that I remember I would get sort of thrown at me years ago: advocacy journalism. You're in advocacy journalism. People don't use that phrase anymore because I think more and more mainstream journalists are realizing that they have been advocates for white supremacy. They may not say it that way, but I think of it that way. But they may realize now that advocacy journalism just means being open about your biases, and objective journalism is another way of saying we're not going to admit our biases, right? As Howard Zinn said, you can't be neutral on a moving train. If the train is moving towards white supremacy and you're not pushing back in the other direction and you're just sitting on the train, then you're part of the problem. So yeah, no, we have to reject these notions of objectivity from the mainstream press. It's laughable in today's day and age to claim that.
I was glad you mentioned replacement theory a few minutes ago. The torch-bearing racists at the rally in Charlottesville said, you will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. It's my understanding that in an academic setting, replacement theory was developed by some French theorists, then brought to the United States, adopted by Tucker Carlson and others. I don't know how many of our listeners and viewers are aware of a doctrine and a full-throated theory. Tell us about replacement theory and the extent to which this needs greater examination in the media.
I mean, this goes very much again in line with that story that right-wing conservatives uphold, which is that it's our country, and they're trying to take it from us. Again, back to the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision, they left intact legacy admissions. Legacy admissions were originated at places like Harvard and Yale when they realized that Jewish Americans were getting in and replacing white Protestants. So it was a way to keep Jewish Americans, Eastern Europeans, and Catholics out of places like Harvard, and to preserve, WASP culture, and to ensure that power remained in the hands of white, wealthy Protestant elite property owners and got passed down from generation to generation. And now that people of color are asking for that sort of, for equal treatment, it's seen as them trying to replace whites. And that's basically, yes, the idea is replacement theory. There's definitely been European influences, racist European influences on these ideas, but I don't think we can really, I mean, it's white supremacy is as American as apple pie. It's not something that I think we can really blame other countries for. It is something that we have been, built this nation on. And I honestly think that one of the reasons why the right wing has launched such great attacks on, critical race theory and on the teaching, the tough on crime approach is because we've actually been more successful than we realized, right? It's a backlash. It's a reactionary backlash. The ideas of social justice, the ideas of a multicultural democracy are very attractive ideas, because what did they promise? They promise collective justice. They promise a beautiful, just future for all of us. So that the story of the right is a story of fear, of losing power. What is our story? And that's something that I really think we need to focus on. And it's why one of the reasons why I wrote the book. What is the story that we want to see in our culture, that we want narratives to build? And that is the story of policies that ensure that our children have a future, policies that ensure that infant mortality and maternal mortality rates among Black populations drops to the same level as whites. That is policies that we all have free healthcare because our taxes pay for that healthcare, and that we don't have to worry about having enough money to retire on. These are beautiful things that we can all enjoy and all participate in and all benefit from. And it's precisely because they're so attractive that the right perpetuates ignorance and comes for these policies. And we should rejoice in the fact that we are on the right side of history, right? We are marching in the direction of beautiful, just futures. And that's what they're trying to stop. So how do we make that future vision a reality? By talking about it, by envisioning it, by centering it in our stories, by ensuring that we aren't distracted by the rants of the right, by ensuring also that we're not fueling hopelessness and cynicism, because that's another thing that really has motivated my move to Yes Magazine, where I'm the racial justice editor, because the idea of Yes Magazine is solutions journalism. Everybody knows the world is doomed. So why are left journalists harping on it? Why are we, I can't tell you how many times I've faced people who, when I bring up issues of how things might get better, the response is, well, nothing's going to get better. Well, it's all going to go down to hell. It's all falling apart. The level of cynicism and hopelessness that many of us feel comes from the fact that we're consuming media that is constantly covering disasters and crises and not uplifting what people are actually doing to fix those problems. And I don't mean fluffy, putting a positive spin on a bad story. I mean the fact that we are actually defunding the police in Los Angeles, right? Measure J, which was passed by abolitionist organizations, diverted millions of dollars and is diverting millions of dollars away from jails. And we have abolitionists that are getting elected to our city council, right? Ulysses Hernandez is on the city council. Nithya Raman is on the city council, and was on the city council. We have made progress by uplifting solutions that people are working on who have been forgotten by or been pushed aside or not getting corporate media coverage. And so we don't even realize that it's happening all around us. Some people are like, well, what happened to Black Lives Matter? 3 years ago, everybody was saying Black Lives Matter, and now nothing's happening. So much is happening. It's just not getting coverage. I'm covering it, right? I'm covering it in my work for Yes Magazine. I just did an article about abolition in the latest issue I wanted to showcase for Yes Magazine. Imagining a police-free world, where I talk to activists who are making it happen. Kat Brooks in Oakland, who created alternatives to policing, where people can call a mental health crisis hotline that is a police-free solution to mental health crises. We are winning. And that is precisely why the right is so afraid of it. You know, in a few decades, we're going to be a majority minority country. They hate that. But it is nothing to be afraid of. It is a beautiful thing that our country is turning into. And let's center that beauty, that joy, the promise of that beautiful future so that we can realize that. Otherwise, we're just going to, they're going to win. The right wing will win. And that they're relying on us being cynical and hopeless and apathetic. They're relying on us buying their stories and internalizing their narratives. So that is why I wrote this book. Anyway, sorry, I went down a path that I didn't mean.
No, well, you read my mind, because this was the other part of the equation. And people should begin to raise their hands, as Carol Francis is doing, and we'll take questions in a few minutes. But Sonali, I did want to give you the opportunity to give examples of the kind of journalism, the kind of movie making, the kind of broadcasting that you think is advancing this social justice agenda and a more truthful and comprehensive telling of American history.
Yeah, I mean, and I interviewed several people. I have interviewed so many people over the years, but some of those interviews I showcase in the book who are now household names, right? Like, look at Ryan Coogler. Before he made Black Panther, which, by the way, in the vein of Bridgerton, imagines superheroes as Black. Before he made Black Panther, he made Fruitvale Station, an incredible, powerful movie about Oscar Grant, who was killed by BART police in Oakland. And, Michael B. Jordan was in that film. And, we now think of him as, Eric Killmonger in Black Panther. But Ryan Coogler, nobody else could have made Fruitvale Station other than someone like Ryan Coogler, somebody who comes from Oakland, who knows the reality of policing and racist policing, and who made this beautiful, beautiful film, which I highly recommend. I talked to Ava DuVernay, who before she made Selma and the movies that she's making now, made her own films, started an organization to help other Black filmmakers like herself, and decided not to wait for permission from white Hollywood to start making the films that she wanted to make, just started making them herself, and who comes from social justice backgrounds, right? There are filmmakers now who have entered the canon. Boots Riley's new film, I'm a Virgo. I don't know if you watched this earlier film, Sorry to Bother You. What a fantastic film that was. What a treatise on anti-capitalism. Boots Riley is one of the great filmmakers of our time. Jordan Peele, I mean, you could go on and on. There are some incredible young filmmakers of color. Look at the people who've made Reservation Dogs, an entirely Indigenous-made TV series featuring Indigenous leads, Indigenous writers, Dallas Goldtooth is part of that. That fantastic dark comedy. It's not just representational. It is very good. It's really high quality, and it's funny as hell. And what makes some of these products from Hollywood different, in addition to the fact that on the surface, of course, they're made by Black and brown filmmakers, what makes them different is that the characters they paint are really nuanced. They don't fit into stereotypes, but sometimes they kind of do just for kicks, and then they upend them, and they showcase people of color as we are, complex creatures capable of doing stupid things, but capable of being redeemed. They are making characters like white characters have been made for years. You can make a TV show about a white serial killer who's lovable. I mean, really? So if Hollywood can do that, surely Hollywood can do that for people of color, paint nuanced, complex characters that show us as being full, well-rounded human beings. And when we're seen as well-rounded, full human beings deserving of all of the same rights, then you can't justify policies that demonize us and that are racist.
Excellent. So now we have 4 hands up. Let's take questions, short answers. Carol Francis, and then I'll go to Dick Bunce.
Thank you. Sonali, it's this great history of what's wrong. I wish you would have gotten earlier without Steve needing to ask you, in talking about the great films that have been made. And I will say this as a screenwriter who can't get any of her very political screenplays made into movies. I'm writing them, but they're staying in my computer. I'm beginning to get them out. But movies like, I kept waiting for you to talk about Boots Riley's Sorry to Bother You, which, like you said, is the most fantastic look at capitalism I've ever seen. Gavin Hood, who's a South African white director who Zotzi, a South African Black, who is exactly what you described, somebody who's capable of doing something stupid, but then redeems himself. He also made Official Secrets. I wish you'd talk more about films that not necessarily deal with racism, but deal with pro-US, pro-capitalism, as opposed to something like Official Secrets or Shock and Awe, which was made in the United States, that have an anti-war message. If you would talk more about those films.
Well, that's not the book I wrote, Carol Francis. The book I wrote was about racial justice. Someone should write a book about about narratives on national security, war, empire, etc. Maybe someday I will, but my focus is on racial justice right now. And the reason why it's on racial justice is because for too many decades, the left in this country has undermined the importance of racial injustice. For too many years, we've pushed that aside and said, let's focus on class, let's focus on capitalism. White supremacy white supremacy and capitalism go hand in hand, and we have to talk about race. We have to talk about racial justice and injustice. So that's why I didn't talk about some of the other the things that you wanted me to talk about. But the book that I've written is about race and racial justice, how we start creating a culture where racial justice narratives are dominant, and how we can all be a part of that, because that is my current focus and that is my agenda. After Donald Trump, there were so many of us here in this country, Black and brown people, who felt so betrayed. And I can't tell you, we felt so betrayed I remember walking into a Trader Joe's here in Pasadena the day after the election. And even though I'm in liberal California, I looked around me genuinely afraid, thinking, how many of these people secretly voted for Trump, secretly wish I wasn't here? And that feeling to live in a country where you are not welcomed, to live, I can't even imagine, I don't know what it's like to live as a Black person in America. And I say that very clearly in this country. I'm a non-Black person of color, and the trauma that Black people live with every day in a country that sees them as inferior and are reminded of it every day manifests in real physical ill health, in disease in their genes. And I have felt a calling to be a part of a movement for racial justice. It was really seeing how far the country would go with Trump's presidency that, to me, helped me pivot to what I felt was truly my current focus, which is on racial justice.
And we're so glad you're doing that. Let's do something we've done in the past, because now we have several hands raised. Sonali, if you would make a few notes, we'll take 3 questions, and then you can blend your responses to those 3 questions together. We'll start with Dick Buns, Rick, and then Sophia.
I just can't resist before I ask my question. Donald Trump was not elected by the majority of the American people. He got in because of the Electoral College, gerrymandering, etc. So I had to say that. Okay, speaking of narrative, we have a very wonderful narrative here. The effect that, that First Amendment, free speech rights, I hate what you say, but I love your right to say it, etc., etc. Under that canopy sneaks the decision of the Supreme Court announced this morning by a vote of 6-3, the predictable supermajority, that it's fine for a website designer to say, no, I will not work with you, to a couple, 2 women or 2 men who want to get married. And that is that person's right under the First Amendment. I wonder if you'd comment on that. And I asked the question with a certain bias, and that is that the right is quite clever. They're thinking all the time, and we're caught flat-footed, and will be again this time. Can you help a little more with that? What do we have to do to be more ready for this kind of narrow-minded twisting of the law? How do we deal with this?
So consider that, Sonali, and then we'll go to Rick.
So I think that I appreciate your views on a lot of the narrative focus, especially around racial injustice. I would say there's one of the shows that I thought did a little bit better than most was a TV show on Amazon called Them, that Little Marvin wrote, where ostensibly you have to write about something that's in the horror vein to get a focus on social issues at this point. But along with that, there was a focus on redlining, especially in Los Angeles. And I think for a lot of people, that a lot of people didn't even know about that. I was in a meeting last year with somebody that said, "Oh, everybody should have, everybody has the same place that they start from, and this kind of thing." And I said, we're next to Ladera Heights, right? A community that was put up because a lot of the people that could afford housing in other parts of Los Angeles were being redlined out of those places. And, they didn't know about that. So that's something to take a look at. I do think that it has been changing, but like you said, there's a lot of pressure on the writers that are in those rooms, like maybe the other people that were with Damon Lindelof and Watchmen, that maybe kept on pushing the narrative and pushing what they could as far as they could, knowing that the showrunner has his own views, right? So I think maybe one thing, if you want to talk about it, is the amount of showrunners of color that are actually being able to do things like get their point across.
Consider that, Sonali. And Sophia, short question.
Yeah, well, first I want to thank Sonali because several years ago, she interviewed me when it dealt with the desecration of our cemetery and the exhumation of bodies at Evergreen. And we're still dealing with that issue, and I sent you a message. But I really wanted you to talk a little bit more about the left, and sometimes they have people of color, but not of culture and consciousness. And those of us that are to the left are excluded when they use people of color and don't allow the people of color, of culture and consciousness to have space.
Great. Gather up your thoughts on those questions, Sonali. Go right ahead.
Yes, I love that last question. And I was just trying to pull up one part of the book where, yeah, okay, I found it. All right. So let's see, on the Supreme Court's decision on so-called free speech and private companies having the right to turn away LGBTQ folks because they violate their beliefs. Yeah, there's all of this logic, and how do we prevent ourselves from being caught flat-footed? I think we have to understand, right? We have to understand not necessarily what they're saying on paper, but where they're coming from. And to do that, we have to understand their narrative that they've accepted. And again, we go back to the big story. What's the big story of the right? The big story of the right is that white people are becoming the minority, straight white men are feeling insecure, and that some other people, others are coming for them. In that vein, things make sense why the Supreme Court conservatives did what they did. And what I like to think about is it's important for us to not get caught up in the details of their logic, right? Instead of saying, well, how do we counter on a logical basis and a rational basis what they're saying? First of all, there's armies of lawyers that are amazing lawyers that are countering it, and I rely on them and I laud them, and we should support them. But what we need to think about is, how do we change the system so that we don't have 6 conservatives in positions of power that can completely rewrite the rules of society, right? That's what we got to keep our eyes on the prize. Right now, there's 6 individuals in the nation's highest court that are rewriting, that are undoing progress. How do we change that? Do we change that by expanding the court? Do we change that by electing more progressives to Congress and to the Senate, which is where judicial nominations get decided upon? That is the place where we need to focus our effort to change that system. Do we change it on, or do we focus it on legislating these issues rather than relying on the Supreme Court to create precedent, right? Because the Supreme Court is there to judge whether or not laws have been broken and to create precedents that are then followed. But really, it's a job of lawmakers to make laws. So why are we not making laws that make the things that we like legal and make the things that we don't like illegal? So let's focus on that. And so I think that's really important for us to keep our eyes on that. And not get caught up in and not fall for because they're trying to trap us, they're trying to bait us, and let's not fall for that. Let's look at the bigger picture and focus on how to get them out of power. And on the question from Rick, I did not watch them, but I love that it's showcasing a little known fact about how systemic racism happens I think about the power that Hollywood holds, the power to shape people's views. I look at Ms. Marvel. I don't know how many of you saw that show. Again, it's a superhero show where a young Pakistani girl plays a superhero. And for the first time, I think, as far as I know, for the first time, a mainstream Hollywood production taught audiences about the horrors of partition between India and Pakistan. And for somebody of Indian origin to see that on screen was very important, very powerful. I watched it with my kids. They had all these questions about partition that they would have never asked if I had said, let me read you a history book about partition and on the millions of people that died when the British randomly drew a line on a map. They would probably have rolled their eyes, gotten bored, and walked out of the room. But we watched a TV show about it, and it educated my children about this history. And so, yes, there's so much power. There are more showrunners of color. One of the people that I showcase in the book is Rosa Clemente. She ran for vice president with the Green Party many years ago. She's someone whose work I follow and whose lead I follow. And she helped to make a film. Where is it? Judas and the Black Messiah, about Fred Hampton, chair of the Illinois Black Panther Party. The film was made by 3 Black filmmakers, Ryan Coogler, Shaka King, and Charles King. And Charles King, she says, was one of the few Black executives in Hollywood. And so we need not just Black and brown writers in the writer's room, and showrunners, but we also need executives, right, in the executive suites pushing through. And so there's people there. And then on the last question about culture, I write about, from Sophia, I do write about the way in which, for example, Disney would love to get Latino audiences to watch their movies. And when Disney, before Disney made the film Coco, they tried to copyright, or was it patent, Dia de los Muertos, that phrase. They tried to take ownership of this cultural phenomenon that they knew little about and had no right to own. And it wasn't until people from right here in Southern California, some of our friends and allies, like people like Lalo Alcaraz and Ofelia Esparza from East LA, who were brought in as consultants and who basically said, we don't want, brown facing on this movie. It wasn't until people like them helped in the making of this movie that Coco became a film that really, that reflected a culture in a way that was respectful. And so we have to be very careful about Hollywood doing shows and movies that simply reduce our cultures and take them over the way to make money. No, we can't allow that. So, that's something that I write about as well. So yeah, I think I answered all the questions.
You did a good job, Sonali. Very good. Look, we are so grateful for today. We're grateful for the work you do. I don't know if off the top of your head in the next week or so, do you know of your book signings that people can join you?
I'll be at Romans on July 19th. I'll be at Skylight Books on July 13th. It's all on my website, risingupwithsonali.com. That's the best place to look for it. Can I just very quickly, though, something that no one asked me about that I really feel like I'd like to bring up, because we're talking to, the question of what can I do as an individual? Is that right? So one of the things that I write about at the end of my book, yes, mass media has the power to shape culture in a big way, but if not all of us have the privilege of being a writer in Hollywood. And so one of the things that I write about is a method that People's Action, which is a great grassroots organization, has been using as a way to change people's minds. It's called deep canvassing. I highly encourage you to look it up. Deep canvassing is a new name for an old school way of talking to people and changing people's minds. And it happens person to person, one person at a time. And it's a way to use basically a psychological approach of empathy to get people to drop their armor that has been built up by Fox News and to cut through the ignorance and the story of white supremacy. And so for example, if you want to convince somebody about the importance of LGBTQ rights, instead of asking them where they stand on the issue, you talk to them about your life. You talk to them about who you are and the people you know, and you get them to when you're standing in front of them as a human being and you show the pain that you might be going through or the things that you're experiencing, it's really hard for them to ignore the fact that you're a real person deserving of full rights. This is not something that I recommend everybody must do or should do, because there are some people in our country who have been so deeply traumatized by white supremacy that it's not their job to go and confront white supremacists to change their mind. It's up to the rest of us to do it when they can't. There are many communities of color and people of color who feel like they have to protect themselves from having to do things like talking to a Trump supporter. But the rest of us who can stomach it really ought to consider the modes of deep canvassing to change minds, because tiny changes in tiny parts of the country can have a big impact when it comes, for example, election time, or when it comes time to pass ballot measures. So I really recommend people look into the idea of deep canvassing as something that individuals can do.
Excellent. Thanks for ending on that note and giving us an action item. We appreciate you so much. Thank you. Good luck to you. Stay with us as we close our circle. In that vein, I will say that we'll be celebrating, if that's the word, July 4th next week. And I hope people, instead of a jingoistic, patriotic acknowledgement of July 4th, would read instead Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to a slave is the 4th of July." That's a lesson and a narrative we need to lift up to avoid the celebration as if the founding of this nation, largely by slave-owning white men, is the be-all and end-all of the American story. The American story really restarted with the new birth of freedom and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.